He was my stepfather, but in that moment he became something more. Everything I'd been holding in came out. One moment, and our lives would never be the same again. But then what happened? You won't believe it. Ava had just finished college and returned home to New York, hoping to rebuild her life, find a job, and discover herself. She thought she'd be stepping back into the familiar warmth of her childhood home, but what she didn't expect was how much things had changed. Her mother, Sophia, was completely absorbed in her career and her new marriage to James. He seemed like the perfect man, charming, successful, and devoted to Sophia. But to Ava, he was a stranger. She couldn't understand why her mother married him. James had this cold, distant aura about him, something Ava couldn't quite place. It wasn't just James that had changed. When Ava returned, she quickly realized her relationship with her mother wasn't as close as it had once been. Sophia was absent more often than not, consumed by work, leaving Ava to face the house and her feelings of isolation on her own. It was as though the home Ava had once known no longer existed. But James seemed to fill the void, slowly. At first, it was harmless, a few casual conversations, nothing more. But slowly, Ava found herself spending more time with him, and it was then that she started noticing things she hadn't before. He wasn't just her mother's new husband. There was something more to him, and the more she interacted with him, the more Ava realized that her feelings for James were beginning to change in a way she didn't want to admit. Chapter 2. Beneath the family's surface. In the beginning, it had seemed so innocent. James was always there, offering small gestures of kindness, helping with the house, asking about her day. But it didn't stay that way for long. Ava began noticing that their conversations weren't just polite anymore. They were deeper, more personal. James started sharing his childhood memories, his hopes, and his insecurities. Ava realized, to her shock, that she was listening more intently than she had ever listened to anyone before. There was a depth to him that she hadn't expected, and it made him seem less like a stranger. The more time they spent together, the more Ava found herself drawn to him. He wasn't perfect, not by any means, but there was something compelling about him. He was intelligent, well-spoken, and unexpectedly charming. She found herself looking at him differently, noticing things that she had never seen before: his smile, the way he moved, the quiet strength in his eyes. And the more she saw, the more she realized her feelings for him were growing in a way she couldn't control. She had tried to dismiss it, tried to tell herself that this was all in her head, but every time James smiled at her, or asked her about her thoughts on something, it felt different. It felt like he was seeing her in a way that no one had before. Slowly, her respect for him began to morph into something far more complicated. Chapter 3. The Unspoken Attraction. It was one evening, when Sophia was away on a business trip, that everything changed. Ava found herself alone with James. They had spent the whole day together, watching movies, talking about their lives, discussing everything from childhood to adult anxieties. They had grown closer over the past few weeks, and now the line between friendship and something else felt blurred. Sitting in the living room, Ava noticed how much she had come to rely on James' presence. His voice, his laughter, it all seemed so familiar, so comforting. She didn't even notice how close they had gotten until it was too late. Their conversation shifted from casual topics to something deeper, something more personal. James leaned in, his face close to hers, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to disappear. Their hands brushed as they reached for the same bowl of popcorn. Ava's heart skipped a beat. She didn't pull away. Neither of them did. It wasn't a sexual moment, not at first. But the energy between them had shifted, and Ava could feel it, the weight of everything they hadn't said, everything they hadn't acknowledged. She looked into his eyes, and for the first time, she didn't see her mother's husband. She saw a man who had somehow come to mean more to her than she was willing to admit. Chapter 4. The Point of No Return. As the days passed, Ava tried to avoid James. She told herself it was just a phase, just the result of being too emotionally vulnerable. But every time they spoke, every time they shared a quiet moment, that invisible thread between them seemed to tighten. The guilt began to consume her, but so did the attraction. She couldn't deny it any longer. She was falling for him. One evening, when they were left alone once more, the tension between them was unbearable. They were sitting side by side on the couch, a silence settling between them that felt heavier than any words could convey. Ava felt her pulse quicken as James turned toward her, his face inches from hers. "I don't know how to stop feeling this way," James said, his voice thick with emotion. Ava's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to say something, anything to break the moment, but the words stuck in her throat. All she could do was look at him, her heart racing. Before she knew it, James' hand brushed against her cheek, and all of her self-control evaporated. Their lips met in a kiss that was soft at first, tentative, as if they were both testing the waters. But it didn't stay that way. The kiss deepened, and Ava felt herself losing control, losing herself in the heat of the moment. This was wrong. She knew it was wrong, but in that moment, she couldn't stop. She didn't want to. Chapter 5: Consequences. The moment they broke apart, the realization hit both of them like a tidal wave. What they had just done could never be undone. Ava's heart pounded in her chest, and she stood up quickly, backing away from him. I can't do this," she whispered, her voice shaking. "This is wrong." James looked at her, his face filled with confusion and regret. "I never meant for this to happen," he said softly. "But I can't deny how I feel either." Ava backed out of the room, her mind spinning, her body shaking with a mixture of desire and guilt. She knew that nothing would ever be the same. Everything had changed in a matter of seconds. The hardest part was that she didn't know how to move forward from here. When I returned to New York, I had no idea what I would find. Sure, I was back home, but everything felt different. My mother, Sophia, wasn't the same woman I remembered. She had changed. Her career was everything now. She had married James, a man I barely knew, and honestly, I felt like an outsider in my own house. James, to everyone else, seemed perfect. He was successful, charming, always the right thing to say at the right moment. He was everything my mother had ever wanted. But to me, he was cold, distant, and frankly, I couldn't understand why my mother had married him. He was nothing like the warm, supportive man I had imagined for her. But I kept quiet, didn't want to cause problems, especially since my mother seemed so happy. The truth was, when I arrived, I was hoping for some comfort, some sense of familiarity. I thought my mom would be there, ready to catch me when I fell. But instead, she was buried in work, leaving me to deal with the loneliness I had thought I had left behind. I thought I could adjust. I thought I could find myself again after everything that had happened with my life in college. But I wasn't ready for the reality of what I came back to. James, though, was the one constant presence. At first, I kept my distance, just like I always had. But then something started to shift. He began talking to me more, asking about my plans, my future, the kind of questions my mother used to ask. At first, it was nothing special. He wasn't intrusive, just offering support, a listening ear when I needed one. He even helped me with a few things around the house. I had always thought of him as an outsider, but over time, I realized he wasn't just my mother's husband. He was a man with his own history, his own pain, and somewhere, under that cold exterior, there was warmth that I never expected to find. We began to talk more. Small talk turned into real conversations. James shared stories about his past, his experiences growing up, things that made me see him as more than just a distant figure in my life. Slowly, I started to realize that he wasn't the stranger I had always thought him to be. The more he shared, the more I felt a strange connection. I had always thought of him as a shadow, an accessory in my mother's life, but he was more than that. One evening, we were sitting together in the living room. Sophia was away for work again, and it was just the two of us. At first, we sat in silence. He had asked me about how I was doing, what my plans for the future were, and we had fallen into the usual routine of me answering with vague responses. But this time, something felt different. The quiet was no longer uncomfortable. It was easy, the kind of silence that feels natural. James was sitting across from me, and I found myself studying him. I wasn't just listening to his words. I was noticing the way he spoke, the way his expression changed when he spoke of certain memories. "Do you ever feel like life is passing you by, Ava?" he asked suddenly, his voice gentle but serious. "Like you're waiting for something to happen, but it never does?" I was taken aback by the question. I hadn't expected it. It was as if he could see right through me, right into the parts of myself I hadn't wanted to confront. I swallowed hard, trying to form an answer. "Yeah, I think I've been feeling like that for a while," I admitted. "Like I'm stuck, you know? Everyone has their life together, and here I am, just trying to figure out what comes next." James nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "I get it. It's hard when you don't know where you're going. But sometimes, the answer doesn't come in a big, dramatic moment. Sometimes, it's just about letting things happen naturally, about allowing yourself to feel the path instead of trying to force it." I looked at him, surprised by how much I agreed with what he was saying. It was almost as if he had been reading my mind. Maybe I had underestimated him. Maybe he wasn't just my mother's husband. Maybe there was more to him than I had ever given him credit for. We talked for hours that night. It was one of the longest, most genuine conversations I'd had in a long time. And as the evening wore on, I found myself not wanting it to end. The more I spoke to him, the more I realized how much he understood, how much his words resonated with me. It was strange how quickly the gap between us had closed. The man I had once dismissed as distant and cold now felt like someone I could talk to, someone who saw me, really saw me, in a way I didn't think anyone had. But as we sat there, talking long into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. It wasn't just the conversation. It was the way he looked at me, the way his eyes lingered a little too long when they met mine. It was the small gestures, his hand brushing mine as he passed me a drink, the way he smiled just a little more when we spoke. Something was changing between us, and though I didn't want to admit it, I felt it. I couldn't ignore it. James was no longer just the man who married my mother. He was someone I was beginning to see in a completely different light, someone I was starting to understand in a way I never thought possible. And that realization terrified me. The more I spent time with James, the more I began to notice little things I had never paid attention to before. The way he moved through the house with ease, his calm confidence in every action. His voice, always steady and sure, had a quiet power to it. It was strange. How could I be feeling this way about him? He was my stepfather, for God's sake. He was married to my mother. And yet, every time I looked at him, I couldn't ignore the pull that seemed to grow stronger between us. At first, I chalked it up to loneliness. I had just gotten out of college and moved back in with my mother. My life felt like it was in limbo, and I told myself this was just a phase, just the side effects of the mess I had left behind. But as the days went on, I found myself craving more of his presence. It wasn't anything overt, at least not at first. But every time he spoke, I found myself hanging on to his words, noticing things I'd never noticed before. One evening, we found ourselves alone again. Sophia had gone out for a work event, and I was left at home with James, again. I wasn't expecting anything to happen. In fact, I had convinced myself that I'd spent enough time trying to suppress whatever strange feelings had been growing. But when he suggested we watch a movie together, I found myself agreeing without hesitation. We sat on the couch together, too close for comfort, but not so much that it felt inappropriate. I tried to focus on the movie, but my mind was racing. All I could think about was how close he was, how the air between us felt thick, charged. It was during a particularly intense scene in the film that our eyes met. He had leaned in to adjust the remote, and for just a second, our gazes locked. My heart skipped a beat, and I swear I saw something shift in his eyes, a flicker of understanding, or maybe desire. But I quickly looked away, embarrassed by the thought. What the hell was wrong with me? Why was I even thinking this way? Still, we stayed sitting there, silent, watching the movie, but neither of us really paying attention anymore. I felt his presence next to me more than ever, like a weight pressing on my chest. And every time I stole a glance at him, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was aware of my every move, that he could sense how I was struggling with this magnetic pull. And then, it happened. During a particularly quiet moment, he casually brushed his hand against mine, just for a second, but it sent a shock through my entire body. I froze, unsure of what to do. My heart was racing, my breath shallow. The touch had been so light, so innocent, but it felt like a spark, igniting something that I knew shouldn't be there. I quickly pulled my hand away, trying to calm myself down. "Sorry," I muttered, pretending to adjust myself on the couch, hoping he hadn't noticed how deeply the moment had affected me. But when I looked over at him, I could see the way his eyes had softened, the way his lips parted ever so slightly as though he were waiting for something, waiting for me to react. I forced a smile and turned my attention back to the screen, trying to ignore the overwhelming tension in the air. But no matter how much I tried, I couldn't stop my mind from racing. The whole night, I felt like I was walking on a tightrope, and at any moment, I could fall into a deep, dangerous abyss. I wasn't just emotionally confused anymore. I was physically aware of him in a way that felt almost suffocating. Later that night, when I went to bed, I lay there staring at the ceiling, my thoughts consumed by him. I tried to push it away, tell myself that I was just lonely, that I was imagining things, but the truth was undeniable. There was something between us, something I couldn't explain. The next day, I couldn't look at him the same way. Every time he came into the room, I felt a rush of heat flood my body, and I had to force myself to breathe normally. I caught myself watching him, stealing glances when he wasn't paying attention. And when he spoke to me, I could feel my pulse quicken. It wasn't like anything I had ever experienced before, and that terrified me. I knew this was wrong. I knew I had to keep my distance. He was my stepfather. He was married to my mother, Nothing about this could be right. And yet, the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger the feelings became. I couldn't stop thinking about him. Couldn't stop the way my body reacted every time he was near. It was like a craving I couldn't satisfy, a hunger that gnawed at me. And with every passing day, I knew that the line between what was acceptable and what was not was becoming increasingly blurred. The days stretched on, and with each one, it felt like the invisible thread between James and I was growing tighter, pulling us closer in ways that felt impossible to ignore. I tried to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I was reading too much into simple gestures and fleeting moments. But every time I saw him, every time we spoke, I felt the heat rising between us like a slow-burning fire that I couldn't extinguish, no matter how hard I tried. The guilt was always there, lingering like a shadow in the background. I knew what we were doing was wrong. He was married to my mother. I was her daughter. We were crossing lines we should never have approached. But despite the voice in my head screaming at me to stop, I found myself unable to pull away. The more time I spent with him, the more I needed him, and I hated myself for it. I hated how easily my heart raced when he looked at me, how my thoughts seemed to always return to him no matter what I did. It was as if my body was betraying me, reacting to him in ways I could never have anticipated. It all came to a head one evening when Sophia had to leave town for a business trip. The house was quiet, just James and I again, alone. I thought I could handle it. I thought that by now, I'd have a grip on my emotions. But I didn't. Not when James walked into the living room, looking as calm and composed as ever, and invited me to sit with him and talk. "Let's just have a quiet night in," he said, his voice steady and warm. "It's been a while since we've had time to just talk. How are you feeling about everything, Ava?" I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to share any more of myself with him. Didn't want to expose the chaotic mess of emotions I was struggling to control. But I couldn't help myself. There was something in the way he asked, something in his eyes that made me open up to him without even thinking. As we sat down on the couch, I found myself telling him everything. The loneliness, the confusion, how I was still trying to make sense of my life. He listened, as always, without interruption, his eyes never leaving mine. His silence was soothing. His understanding more profound than I was prepared for. The way he listened made me feel safe, and that feeling made me weak. I had never wanted anyone to understand me as much as I wanted him to. I could feel the air between us growing thicker, more charged. My words started to slow as I realized how close we were sitting, how my body was positioned so that I could feel the warmth of his presence next to me. I shifted slightly, trying to create space, but instead, I only felt more acutely aware of him. James reached out, his hand brushing against mine as he adjusted the blanket between us. The touch, though innocent, sent a jolt through my system. It wasn't the first time he had touched me like that, but something about the way he did it tonight felt different. The way his fingers lingered, even if just for a second, felt like an invitation. I pulled my hand back quickly, my heart racing. "Sorry," I muttered, trying to brush it off, but the words felt hollow. James didn't pull away. Instead, his gaze softened, and he leaned in closer. "Ava," he said, his voice low and gentle, "it's okay. I'm not going to judge you, but I want you to know that you're not alone in this. Whatever you're feeling, I'm here." His words should have been comforting. They should have made me feel safer, like I could let my guard down. But instead, they only made my pulse race faster. The vulnerability in his voice was so raw, so open, that I couldn't help but wonder if he felt the same pull I did. If he had been hiding the same feelings, the same desire. Without thinking, I found myself turning toward him. Our faces were inches apart now, and I could feel his breath on my skin. I could hear my heartbeat thundering in my ears, and the weight of the moment was unbearable. My mind screamed at me to pull away, to stop this before it went too far, but I couldn't. Not when he was looking at me like that. "Ava," he whispered again, his voice filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place. "This is wrong, but I can't stop thinking about it. I can't stop thinking about you." The words hit me like a tidal wave. I wanted to scream, to push him away and run, but instead, I found myself leaning in, drawn to him, drawn to the warmth, to the desire that had been building between us for so long. And then, before I could stop myself, our lips met. It was soft at first, tentative, but it didn't stay that way. The kiss deepened quickly, and all I could feel was the heat, the pressure, the intensity of it. I knew this was wrong. Knew that the consequences of what we were doing could destroy everything. But in that moment, I didn't care. I didn't care about the rules, about the consequences. I only cared about the feeling of being wanted, of being seen. The kiss broke as quickly as it had started, and we both pulled away, breathless. We stared at each other in shock, in disbelief, as the reality of what we had done began to sink in. I started, but the words caught in my throat. James was quiet for a long moment, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and desire. "We can't go back from this, Ava," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "But I can't undo what just happened. I don't think either of us can." I stood up quickly, my mind racing. "I need to go," I muttered, my voice shaky. I couldn't stay in the room with him, couldn't process what had just happened between us. As I walked away, I knew this was only the beginning. Whatever had started between us couldn't be undone, and I had no idea where it would lead. But I knew it was something neither of us would be able to stop. The days after that night felt like I was living in a fog. I could barely focus on anything. My thoughts were consumed by what had happened with James. The kiss, the way his lips had felt against mine. I couldn't shake the feeling of his hand on my skin, the warmth of his touch. It was a strange, overwhelming mix of guilt and desire. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, and every time I saw him, I felt my heart race. I tried to avoid him as much as possible, keeping myself busy with small tasks around the house, trying to keep my mind from wandering. But he was always there, his presence like a shadow I couldn't escape. I could feel his eyes on me when I walked into a room, feel the electricity between us whenever we spoke. He said nothing about the kiss, and neither did I, but the tension between us had only grown thicker. It didn't help that my mother, Sophia, had been away for another week on a business trip. She had no idea what was happening between James and me. And part of me wished I could turn back time, go back to before everything had changed. But I couldn't. There was no going back now. I was sitting alone in the kitchen one evening, eating a quick dinner when I heard James approach. My heart skipped a beat. He was back from a meeting, and I could hear his footsteps in the hallway. I immediately tensed up, trying to calm my nerves. I couldn't afford to let him see how much he affected me. He walked in, looking as calm and composed as ever, but there was something different in his eyes. The same intensity one had seen before was there again, and it made my pulse quicken. I tried not to look at him, but I could feel the heat between us, even across the room. "Hey," he said, his voice low and almost hesitant. "Can we talk?" I didn't know how to respond. Everything in me screamed to avoid him, to distance myself, but my body betrayed me. I nodded without thinking, and he moved to the table, sitting down across from me. There was no hiding it now. I couldn't pretend like nothing had happened. "How have you been?" he asked, his voice casual, but I could see the way his eyes lingered on me. I cleared my throat, trying to keep it together. "I've been fine, just busy." There was a brief silence between us, and I could feel the weight of the unspoken words hanging in the air. Finally, he spoke again. "I don't know how to do this, Ava," he said, his voice more serious now. "I don't know how to act around you. After what happened between us, I can't stop thinking about it. About you." I looked down at my plate, not able to meet his eyes. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my hands were shaking slightly. This was happening, and there was no turning back now. I started, but the words wouldn't come. I didn't know what to say. How could I even begin to explain what was happening inside me? James leaned forward, his hand resting on the table. "I know this isn't right, Ava. I know what this could do to our family, to you, to everyone. But I can't ignore what's happening between us. It's too strong. I've tried to fight it, but I can't." I felt my breath catch in my throat as he spoke. My mind was spinning. I wanted to say something, to tell him that it couldn't go on, that I couldn't keep feeling the way I did. But the truth was, I didn't want it to stop. I didn't want to let go of the connection we shared, even if it terrified me. Even though I knew it was wrong, I stood up abruptly, walking away from the table to try and clear my head. "I don't know what you expect me to say," I whispered, my back to him. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do." James stood up, slowly approaching me, but I didn't turn around. I could feel the tension building between us, and I knew that if I looked at him again, I wouldn't be able to stop myself from doing something I might regret. But then I felt him, his hand gently on my shoulder, turning me around to face him. "Tell me you don't feel it," he said, his voice low and intense. "Tell me you don't feel the same way." I couldn't lie to him, and I couldn't lie to myself either. I felt it. The pull, the desire, the need. It was like nothing I had ever experienced before, and it scared me. But in that moment, I felt like I had no choice. I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I do feel it, but I don't know what to do with it." He didn't say anything for a moment, just held me there, his hands gently on my shoulders. "Neither do I," he said softly, "but I can't just ignore it. We can't ignore it anymore, Ava." The air between us was charged, heavy with unspoken desire, with fear, with guilt. And in that moment, neither of us knew what to do. Neither of us knew how to stop what was happening. But the truth was, I didn't want to stop it. Not anymore. It was impossible to ignore what had happened between us. I thought I could pull away, that I could convince myself this was just a momentary lapse in judgment, but I couldn't. The truth was undeniable. The feelings, the desire, everything between James and I had already crossed a line that neither of us could take back. And no matter how much I tried to fight it, I knew that what we had shared, what we were still sharing, was no longer something I could walk away from. That night, after our conversation, everything felt different. The house was quieter than usual. Sophia was still away, and James and I were left alone in the silence, each of us carrying the weight of what had just been confessed. I had always told myself that I could control my emotions, that I could ignore the things I didn't want to face. But when I looked at him, really looked at him, I knew there was no going back. I had convinced myself that our connection was just a passing phase, but now I realized it was so much more than that. The pull between us was magnetic, and as much as I tried to fight it, I could feel it drawing me closer to him. Every time we spoke, every touch, every lingering glance, it was like a slow burn that I couldn't extinguish. It happened so quickly, so suddenly, that I didn't even have time to stop myself. James stood up, his movements slow but deliberate. Without saying a word, he crossed the room to where I stood, my heart racing in my chest. I should have told him to stop. I should have walked away. But instead, I froze, my breath catching in my throat as he reached for me. "Are you sure you want to do this?" His voice was low, barely above a whisper, but it was filled with urgency. His eyes searched mine, looking for an answer that neither of us could articulate. I didn't answer. I couldn't. All I could do was nod, my body betraying me as I stepped closer to him. There was no point in pretending anymore. The tension between us had been building for too long, and now, it was impossible to ignore. He leaned in, and this time, I didn't pull away. I couldn't. Our lips met, but this time, there was nothing tentative about it. It was raw, desperate, and it felt like the world around us had disappeared. The kiss deepened, and I could feel the heat building between us, the intensity of everything we hadn't said. The truth was, I didn't want to stop. I didn't want to pull away, not when I felt this way, not when everything in me screamed to be closer to him. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless, our bodies still trembling from the intensity of the moment. I knew we had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. But I didn't care anymore. I didn't care about the consequences, about the guilt, about the fact that he was my stepfather. In that moment, all I cared about was the way he made me feel alive, seen, wanted. James looked at me, his expression a mix of regret and something else I couldn't place. "We can't go back from this, Ava," he whispered, his hand gently cupping my face. I closed my eyes, fighting the wave of emotions that surged through me. "I know," I said quietly. "I don't want to go back." His thumb brushed against my skin, and for a moment, it felt like the world outside didn't exist. We were in our own little bubble, and everything else faded away. "Then what happens now?" he asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. I didn't have an answer. How could I? I didn't know what the future held for us. But in that moment, I knew I couldn't deny what had happened between us. The truth was, we were too far gone now. There was no going back, no pretending that nothing had changed. "I don't know," I whispered, "but I don't think I can stop this." James didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The silence between us was heavy with the weight of everything that had just transpired. We stood there for a moment, just looking at each other, both of us knowing that what we had just done would change everything. The door opened a few minutes later, and I heard Sophia's voice in the hallway, but it felt like we were in a different world now. A world where none of the rules applied, where nothing made sense anymore. I turned away quickly, trying to pull myself together before my mother entered. James stepped back, giving me space, but the tension between us didn't ease. It was still there, hanging in the air, as palpable as the heat we had shared. Sophia entered the room, oblivious to what had just happened. She smiled at us both, but I couldn't look at her. Not now, not with everything that had changed. "Hey, you too," Sophia said, her voice bright and cheerful. "How was the evening?" I managed to smile, but it felt fake, hollow. "It was fine," I said quickly, looking anywhere but at James. My heart was still racing, my body still trembling from the aftermath of everything. Sophia seemed to notice the tension, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she went about her usual routine, completely unaware of the storm that had just erupted in our lives. As she continued talking, I felt the weight of the secret pressing down on me. I knew I couldn't keep living this lie. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. James and I had crossed a line, and there was no going back from it. But the truth was, I wasn't sure if I wanted to go back. I wasn't sure if I was ready to face the consequences of what we had done. All I knew was that nothing in my life would ever be the same again.